Thank you.
So I decided to do mass communication, and I wanted to focus on magazines and newspapers and tell you about the history of it and then how it is like today. So the definition of mass communication is the transmission of information to large numbers of people through the mass media, and that is according to communicationsmajor.com. Okay, so mass communication, that includes things such as magazines, newspaper, TV, radio, film, websites, advertising, journalism, and politics, especially when they're campaigning and doing campaign speeches. Alright, so now I want to focus on the history and the newspapers of the history of newspapers. So in 1690, America's first newspaper was published, and it was published by Benjamin Harris. Except that the day it was published, it was also that the day it had ended. His article was on how English military forces had allied themselves with savages, and it was not a big hit. It had brought a lot of resentment, which ultimately led to its demise. While in 1704, John Campbell had published the Boston Newsletter. And unlike Benjamin's newspaper, his was successful, which is why some people believe that John's newspaper is actually the first newspaper that was published because of its success. But it is not. Benjamin's newspaper is actually the first newspaper published, it's just that it wasn't successful. The Boston newspaper was actually so successful that the publication had continued for 72 more years. And this was the start of newspapers because people saw the success in John's work and realized that you could make a profit over it. Okay, so later on in 1741, there was a battle that had formed between Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Bradford. The two were both competing to be the first person in America to publish the first magazine. Unfortunately, Andrew had beat out Benjamin by 3 days, and since his magazine was successful, by the 18th century, there were more than 100 magazines that had been published. But unlike newspapers, people had been writing magazines for the public entertainment, and already right there, they were gaining a bigger audience because they were appealing to more of the funny and humor of people. So magazines have changed a lot over time, and as you can see, like by the pictures here, it shows magazines from the 1940s to 2010. And so the printing press really helped magazines get started because it allowed for mass production, and that helped magazines to be put out there and discovered. Also, back then, magazines were more natural because there wasn't the Photoshop and digital editing that they have today. But over time, women had started going to work and they had less time to actually sit down and read. So magazines started shifting to printing more pictures and less words because there just wasn't enough time for people to actually sit down and read a full magazine. And through that, there also became more gossip because there would be a picture taken and then it would be blown up, so people would want to read it. So newspapers over time. So they had their ups and downs. So the printing press, it really allowed for millions of copies, just like magazines, but before newspapers had been handwritten, so the printing press really allowed mass production. The demand of it was soon higher, which allowed the price to go up. But when magazines came out, they were actually cheaper and they were more liked. So this caused the cost of newspapers to go down again. And since there was a loss of public interest, newspapers hit a hard time and magazines were at its high. Newspapers also started to become more entertaining and not just informative to compete with magazines. They wrote about issues that the public could more connect to, so to be just as the competitive level with magazines. Then later on, internet and technology became a big part of people's lives, so newspapers had to switch and they had to adapt to what people were using, and so they started putting them online, so there was online access. here is when newspapers really skyrocketed and the demand was high. And then when magazines came out and online stuff, newspapers started to fall and they just weren't as popular. So today in magazines, women are more exposed and it's less natural, it's more superficial, there's more gossip, there's not as many things that are actually real, and it can be hard to decipher which ones are real, which ones fake. The audience has also gotten broader. Magazines have interviewed actors and actresses and talked about them. They also have like home and garden or food magazines. So they cater to a wide variety of audience, and they also appeal to the teens as well as the older generation, which makes them very successful. Well, newspapers today, they talk about real world issues, they include weather and sports. They're more informative still, and because it's an actual newspaper still, it appeals more to the older generation. So they kind of limit their audience clientele, can hurt them in the long run. And as you can see today, there's a lot more magazines and there's a lot more publication of them. So newspapers are going down while magazines are going up. Thank you.